Dr. Ethan Carter stared at the blinking red light on his ship's control panel. A distress signal. Weak, fading, but definitely there. It was coming from a small, uncharted planet in a distant sector of the galaxy. His instincts told him to ignore it. This was a dangerous part of space, filled with unknown threats. But his conscience wouldn't let him turn away. Someone out there needed help, and Ethan was a healer. It was in his nature to save lives. With a deep breath, he adjusted his ship's course and descended toward the planet. As he entered the atmosphere, thick clouds of swirling dust made it hard to see. The scanners picked up a life sign, barely alive. He followed the signal to a rocky canyon, where his ship landed with a soft thud. The air outside was thin and cold. Ethan grabbed his medical kit and stepped onto the barren ground. The distress signal led him to a cave hidden within the rocks. Inside, dim blue light flickered from strange glowing crystals embedded in the walls. And there, lying motionless on the ground, was a figure. She was unlike any being he had ever seen. Her skin was a soft silver blue, shimmering faintly under the crystal light. Her long flowing hair was the color of a midnight sky, and delicate markings ran down her arms like flowing water. She was injured, deep gashes across her side, her breathing shallow. Ethan knelt beside her, quickly assessing her condition. Her wounds weren't just deep, they pulsed with a strange energy. Whatever had attacked her hadn't used a normal weapon. Carefully, he reached into his bag and pulled out a sterilizer, running it over her injuries. The device beeped angrily, struggling to analyze the alien tissue. Ethan cursed under his breath. His equipment wasn't designed for this. Suddenly, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, glowing violet. She stared at him, her expression a mix of fear and confusion. "Easy," Ethan said in a calm voice. "I'm here to help." Her lips parted, but her voice was weak. "You are human." Ethan nodded. "Yes, I picked up your distress signal." She tried to sit up but winced in pain. Ethan gently pressed her back down. "You're badly hurt. Let me treat you." For a moment, she hesitated, studying him. Then, with a slow nod, she relaxed. Ethan worked quickly, using a combination of human medicine and whatever improvisation he could manage. As he bandaged her wounds, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Leora." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile. "Nice to meet you, Leora. Now, can you tell me what happened?" Leora's eyes flickered with fear. "They are coming." Ethan frowned. "Who?" Before she could answer, a loud noise echoed through the canyon. A deep mechanical hum. Ethan's head snapped up. Through the cave entrance, he saw strange alien ships hovering above the ground, scanning the area with bright red lights. Leora gripped his wrist, her strength surprising despite her injuries. "They are hunting me." Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't know who they were, but they had advanced technology, and they were close. He glanced at Leora's weak form. She wouldn't survive another attack. Making a quick decision, he grabbed her arm and pulled it over his shoulder. "We need to get out of here. Now." She tried to stand, but her legs gave out. Ethan caught her, lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than she looked. Outside, the alien ships moved closer, scanning the ground. Their engines hummed like predators sniffing the air for prey. Ethan carried Leora toward his ship, moving as fast as he could while staying low. Then, a deafening alarm blasted through the air. One of the ships had spotted them. A voice, cold and mechanical, echoed through a speaker. "Target identified. Capture alive." Ethan's stomach tightened. They weren't trying to kill her. They wanted her alive. But why? Before he could think, a beam of red energy shot toward them. He dove behind a rock, shielding Leora with his body as the ground exploded nearby. His ship was just ahead. If they could reach it, they had a chance. Leora's breathing was ragged. "They won't stop," she whispered. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Neither will I." With one last sprint, he dashed toward his ship, pressing the emergency ramp button. The doors hissed open. Ethan rushed inside and then slammed the controls. The engines roared to life just as another energy blast struck the ground behind them. As the ship lifted off, Ethan looked out the window. The alien ships were regrouping, preparing to follow. This was far from over. Lyra's fingers curled weakly around his arm. "You shouldn't have saved me." Ethan met her gaze. "Yeah, well, I did." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. Outside, the enemy ships began their pursuit, and Ethan realized he had just stepped into something far bigger than he could ever imagine. Ethan gripped the controls of his ship tightly, his mind racing. The alien pursuers weren't giving up. Their sleek, dark ships moved like shadows, gliding effortlessly through space. Every time he thought he had lost them, they reappeared, tracking him with unnatural precision. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her breathing shallow, her silver-blue skin still pale from her injuries. Her violet eyes flickered with exhaustion, but there was something else there too. Fear. "They won't stop," she murmured. "Not until they have me." Ethan kept his eyes on the display, his fingers dancing across the controls. "Yeah, I got that part. Any idea why?" "Because I'd really love to know what I just risked my life for." Lyra hesitated. She looked away, as if debating whether to tell them. Before she could speak, an alarm blared through the cockpit. The enemy ships had locked onto them. "Damn it," Ethan muttered. He yanked the ship into a sharp turn, sending them into a dense asteroid field. The enemy pilots followed without hesitation, weaving through the jagged rocks with terrifying skill. Ethan's ship wasn't built for combat, but he knew how to push it. He swerved through the asteroids, using the floating debris to shield them from incoming fire. The enemy ships fired relentlessly, red plasma beams slicing through space, missing them by inches. Lyra suddenly gasped, her body tensing. Ethan glanced at her and saw her clutching her side, eyes wide with pain. But something was off. The markings on her skin were glowing. "What's happening?" Ethan asked, trying to focus on flying while keeping an eye on her. Lyra's voice was strained. "My body. It's reacting to your presence." Ethan had no idea what that meant, but he didn't have time to ask. A massive asteroid loomed ahead. He yanked the ship sideways, barely skimming past it. One of the pursuing ships wasn't as lucky. It slammed into the rock, exploding in a flash of light. Only 2 enemy ships remained. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Hang on." He punched the ship's thrusters, diving toward a narrow gap between 2 massive asteroids. The last 2 enemy ships followed, matching his every move. Then Ethan spotted an opportunity. A collapsed asteroid had left a tiny tunnel-like opening, just barely big enough for his ship to squeeze through. It was a reckless move, but he was out of options. With a deep breath, he aimed straight for the gap. The ship shot through the tunnel, scraping the walls but making it out the other side. The first enemy ship tried to follow, but it was too big. It slammed into the asteroid, breaking apart in a fiery explosion. The second ship managed to avoid the crash, but the blast from the explosion sent it spinning out of control. Ethan didn't waste time. He pushed the ship into full speed and blasted out of the asteroid field. Silence filled the cockpit except for the sound of Ethan's heavy breathing. He glanced at Lyra, who was still clutching her side. "We lost them." "For now," Ethan said, though he knew it wouldn't last. Lyra closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. "You're a good pilot." Ethan gave a tired smirk. "Yeah, well, I'd rather not make a habit of outrunning death." He set the ship on autopilot and turned to Lyra. "Okay, now it's your turn. Who are they? Why are they hunting you?" Lyra hesitated, then finally spoke. "They are the Varkari, a powerful faction that believes I am the key to an ancient prophecy." Ethan blinked. "A prophecy?" Lyra nodded. "I carry something inside me. A power that hasn't been seen for thousands of years. The Valkyrie believe that if they control me, they can reshape the balance of the galaxy. Ethan frowned. And what do you believe? Leora looked at him, her violet eyes filled with something unreadable. I believe they are right. Ethan stared at her. He had expected a story about politics or rebellion, not an ancient power that could change the fate of the galaxy. Leora suddenly winced, her body trembling. Ethan grabbed his medical scanner and ran it over her. The readings made no sense. Her DNA was shifting, changing. What's happening to you? He asked, his concern growing. Leora looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. You saved me, Ethan. But in doing so, you may have changed your own fate as well. Ethan sat in the cockpit, staring at Leora as her words echoed in his mind. You may have changed your own fate as well. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had been in dangerous situations before, smuggling injured refugees past war zones, performing surgeries in lawless territories. But this was something else entirely. He had only meant to save a life. Now he was being chased by alien warships and entangled in something he didn't understand. Leora sat across from him, her silver-blue skin glowing faintly under the dim lights. The markings on her arms pulsed in slow waves, like liquid light flowing beneath her skin. She looked exhausted, but there was something else in her expression. Something guarded. Ethan finally broke the silence. Start talking. What exactly did I get myself into? Leora met his gaze. Do you know the history of the Valkyrie? Ethan shook his head. No. I don't even know who they really are, just that they're trying to capture you. Leora took a deep breath. The Valkyrie are not a single species. They are a faction, an empire built on conquest, control, and ancient beliefs. Their entire rule is based on a prophecy that speaks of a being with the power to reshape reality itself. Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. Let me guess. That's you. Leora hesitated before nodding. Yes, I was born with something inside me. An energy that has not existed in thousands of years. It is said that whoever wields it can either bring balance to the universe or plunge it into endless war. Ethan narrowed his eyes. And you think they want to use you as a weapon? Leora nodded. They have spent centuries searching for someone like me. When they found me, they took me from my people. I was their prisoner for years, until I escaped. Ethan frowned. Wait, if you escaped, why were you alone on that planet? Leora's gaze darkened. Because I was betrayed. Someone I trusted led them to me. I barely managed to send a distress signal before they shot me down. Ethan cursed under his breath. Great, so now they think I'm working with you. Leora tilted her head slightly. You are. Ethan sighed. Not by choice. Leora's lips curled into the smallest hint of a smile. And yet you saved me. Ethan shook his head, pushing down his frustration. He didn't regret saving her, but he did regret not knowing what he had gotten himself into. Before he could respond, the ship's proximity alarms blared. Ethan spun back to the controls, his heart pounding. The display lit up with a new contact, a massive cruiser dropping out of warp speed directly in their path. Damn it, he muttered. More of your friends. Leora's face paled. No, that's worse. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls as the ship's scanners updated. The cruiser wasn't Valkyrie. It was a Reaver-class warship, a vessel used by bounty hunters and mercenaries. A voice crackled through the comms, deep and mechanical. Unregistered vessel, power down your engines. You are harboring a high-value target. Surrender her now, and you will be spared. Ethan cursed under his breath. How do they even know we're here? Leora's hands clenched into fists. The Valkyrie must have put a bounty on me. Now every hunter in the sector will be looking for us. Ethan exhaled sharply, as if things couldn't get worse. The bounty hunter ship locked onto them with a tractor beam, and the ship's engines groaned as it was pulled toward the massive vessel. Leora looked at Ethan. We can't let them take me. Ethan's mind raced. Fighting wasn't an option. not against a warship this size. Running wasn't an option either, not while caught in the beam. That left only one choice. He stood up, grabbed a small case from a locker, and tossed it to Leora. "Get ready to move." Leora opened the case, her eyes widening. Inside were 2 breathing masks and a set of grappling harnesses. Ethan activated the ship's manual override, diverting all power to the shields and cutting the engines completely. "What are you doing?" Leora asked. "Buying us a few seconds." The ship shuddered as it was pulled into the bounty hunter's docking bay. The hangar doors hissed open, and Ethan could already see figures moving outside. Heavily armed soldiers, preparing to board. Ethan turned to Leora. "I hope you trust me." She hesitated, then nodded. Ethan grabbed her wrist, pressed a button on his harness, and hit the emergency decompression switch. The ship's cargo bay doors exploded outward, sucking everything into space. The bounty hunters were caught off guard as the sudden vacuum ripped them from their footing. Ethan and Leora, secured by their grappling harnesses, were flung out into the void. But their trajectory was aimed straight at the bounty hunter's own ship. They soared through space, heart-pounding weightlessness surrounding them. Ethan activated his thrusters just in time to land against the outer hull of the enemy vessel. He grabbed Leora's hand and pulled her close, using the ship's structure as cover. Lyra looked at him, breathless. That was reckless. Ethan smirked. "Yeah, but it worked." Below them, the bounty hunters scrambled in chaos, trying to figure out where their targets had gone. Meanwhile, Ethan scanned the enemy ship's hull, searching for a way in. "We're not out of this yet," he said, "but I have an idea." Lyra's eyes gleamed with determination. "Then let's do it." Ethan took a deep breath. He had started this as a simple rescue mission. But now he was in the middle of something much bigger. And somehow, he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan clung to the cold metal hull of the bounty hunter ship, his breathing steady despite the chaos unfolding beneath them. Below, the docking bay was a mess. The hunters were still scrambling, trying to regain control after the unexpected decompression. Leora pressed her back against the hull beside him, adjusting her grip on the grappling harness. "You said you had an idea," she whispered through the comms in her mask. Ethan smirked. "Yeah, we're gonna steal their ship." Leora stared at him for a long moment. "You're insane." "Maybe," Ethan admitted, "but it's our best shot." He pointed toward a hatch a few meters away. It was a maintenance access point, likely leading into the ship's interior. If they could get inside without being noticed, they could reach the bridge and take control. Lyra exhaled, then nodded. "Lead the way." Ethan activated his magnetic boots, stepping carefully across the hull toward the hatch. Lyra followed, her movements surprisingly agile despite her injuries. When they reached the hatch, Ethan pulled out a small cutting tool from his belt and started working on the lock. The metal sizzled as the laser cut through it, the edges glowing red-hot. Lyra kept watch, her violet eyes scanning the area. "They're still looking for us in the docking bay," she whispered. "We have a little time." Ethan finished the cut and pulled the hatch open. A tight maintenance tunnel stretched below them, filled with cables and dim emergency lighting. "After you," Ethan said. Leora slid in first, followed by Ethan. The tunnel was cramped, forcing them to crawl forward. The air smelled of burnt metal and coolant, the scent of a well-used warship. As they moved deeper, Ethan pulled up a holographic display on his wrist device, scanning the ship's internal layout. "All right, bridge is 4 levels up, but we can't take the main corridors. Too many guards." Leora glanced at a junction up ahead. "There's a ventilation system running along the upper decks. If we can squeeze through, we might get close without being seen." Ethan grinned. "You're smarter than you look." Leora smirked. "And you're more reckless than you look." They moved quickly, weaving through the tight spaces of the warship. The metal groaned around them as the ship's engines adjusted, the faint hum of power thrumming beneath their hands. After several tense minutes, they reached an exit vent near the bridge. Ethan carefully pried it open and peeked through. Below, the command center was alive with activity. A towering figure stood at the center, the bounty hunter captain. He was a massive alien with dark, armored skin, his face hidden behind a heavy metal helmet. His glowing red eyes scanned the control panels as his crew worked around him. Ethan could hear him speaking in a deep, guttural voice. They were on that ship. Find them. If we lose this bounty, the Valkyrie will have our heads. Leora tensed beside him. Ethan could feel her pulse quicken through the narrow space between them. We can't fight them all, she whispered. Ethan's mind worked fast. He pulled up the ship's schematics again and found something useful, a secondary control terminal just outside the bridge. He pointed at the map. We don't have to fight them. We just have to lock them in. Leora's eyes widened. You can override the bridge controls. Ethan grinned. You're looking at one of the best slicers this side of the galaxy. They backed away from the vent and crawled toward the control terminal. It was tucked into a side panel, surrounded by conduits and security nodes. Ethan plugged his device into the terminal and started working. Lines of alien code scrolled across his screen. Security systems, door controls, communications. He had to move fast. Leora kept watch. Hurry, she urged. Almost, Ethan muttered. His fingers flew over the interface, bypassing encryption locks. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the ship. Ethan froze. That wasn't me. Leora's expression darkened. They found our ship. They know we're on board. Ethan slammed the final command into the system. The bridge doors sealed shut, trapping the bounty hunter captain and his officers inside. He grabbed Leora's hand. Run. They sprinted down the corridor as the remaining hunters realized what had happened. Shouts filled the air. Heavy boots pounded against the metal floor. Leora pointed ahead. Escape pods. Ethan cursed. No time to steal the ship. We'll have to eject. They dove into an open pod, slamming the door shut as the ship's security forces rounded the corner. A barrage of gunfire rattled against the pod's hull, but Ethan had already punched the launch sequence. With a violent jolt, the pod shot out into space. Ethan and Leora tumbled against the seats as the stars spun wildly around them. Through the small viewport, Ethan saw the bounty hunter's warship shrinking in the distance, its bridge still locked down. For now, they were free. But as he looked ahead, his stomach dropped. A massive Valkyrie dreadnought loomed in the distance, its weapon systems lighting up. Leora's voice was quiet. They found us. Ethan exhaled, his mind racing for another escape plan. This wasn't over. Not even close. The escape pod hurtled through the void, spinning uncontrollably as alarms blared inside the cramped interior. Ethan gritted his teeth, fighting the nausea twisting in his stomach. The pod's small thrusters sputtered, struggling to stabilize their descent. Across from him, Leora was strapped into her seat, her violet eyes locked onto the viewport. Her face was pale, not from fear, but from understanding. She knew what was waiting for them. Ethan finally managed to override the emergency controls, engaging the manual thrusters. The pod's violent spinning slowed, and the shaking eased. Then he saw it. The Valkyrie dreadnought loomed in the distance, its massive form silhouetted against the stars. It wasn't just any warship. It was a command vessel. A ship like that only appeared when something of extreme importance was at stake. Ethan's pulse quickened. They didn't just find us. They were waiting for us. Leora swallowed hard. I told you, they will never stop. The dreadnought's tractor beam engaged, locking onto their pod. Ethan barely had time to curse before the ship jerked violently, dragged through space toward the massive vessel. Leora turned to him. Ethan, listen to me. They cannot take me alive. Ethan met her gaze, his stomach tightening at the absolute seriousness in her voice. That's not happening. Leora gripped the armrests. You don't understand. If they... Before she could finish, the pod slammed into the dreadnought's docking bay, the impact sending a jolt through their bodies. The hiss of decompression followed, then silence. A deep mechanical voice echoed through the ship's comms. Prisoners acquired. Prepare for extraction. Ethan clenched his fists. All right. New plan. Leora tilted her head. You didn't have a plan before. Ethan smirked despite himself. Exactly. The pod doors hissed open, revealing a group of heavily armored Valkyrie soldiers standing in formation, weapons trained on them. At the center of the group stood a figure clad in ornate black and gold armor, his helmet shaped into a fearsome, sharp-edged mask. Unlike the soldiers, his presence was calm, controlled. Lyra's breath caught. No. Ethan glanced at her. Who is he? She barely whispered the name. High Inquisitor Velos. Ethan didn't know much about the Valkyrie hierarchy, but even he recognized that title. An Inquisitor wasn't just a commander. They were executioners, enforcers of Valkyrie rule. Velos took a slow step forward, his voice smooth and calculated. Princess Leora, you've led us on quite the chase. Ethan's brain stalled. Princess. He turned to Leora, who avoided his gaze. Velos continued, his red eyes glowing behind his mask. You should never have left, child. Your place is with your people. Lyra's jaw tightened. I do not belong to the Valkyrie. Velos chuckled softly. That is not for you to decide. His gaze shifted to Ethan. And you? His voice was laced with amusement. A human, interfering in matters beyond his comprehension. I would be impressed if it were not so pathetic. Ethan smirked. Yeah, well, I have a bad habit of annoying people in power. Velos tilted his head. And now you will die for it. The guard surged forward, but before Ethan could react, Leora raised her hands, and the entire docking bay shook. A deep hum filled the air as her glowing markings ignited, flowing like liquid fire across her arms. The very gravity in the room shifted, sending the soldiers staggering backward. Ethan barely had time to register what was happening before Leora turned to him, her eyes glowing with raw power. Run. Then, with a single motion, she unleashed a shockwave, a ripple of energy that sent the Valkyrie forces flying. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He lunged for a fallen soldier's weapon, rolling to avoid the chaotic bursts of gunfire now erupting in the docking bay. Leora stood at the center of it all, her presence radiant and terrifying, her powers fully awakened. Velos, however, didn't flinch. He simply smiled beneath his mask. I see, he murmured. You are finally beginning to understand your purpose. Leora turned toward him, her hands still glowing. I will never serve you. Velos raised his hand. Energy crackled around him. Ethan realized, too late, that he wasn't just an inquisitor. He was something more. Velos moved faster than the eye could track, his hand snapping forward. A whip of pure energy lashed out, wrapping around Leora's throat. She gasped, her body jerking as the power drained from her. Ethan's heart pounded. No. He raised his stolen weapon and fired. Velos didn't even turn. The shot froze in midair, suspended as if time itself had stopped. Ethan barely had time to curse before something slammed into his chest, sending him flying backward. Darkness closed in. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Leora, her body collapsing into Velos's grasp. And then, nothing. Ethan's eyes fluttered open. And for a moment, he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of burning metal and stale air. His body ached, bruises and cuts covering him from the brutal assault. His head pounded like a drum. And for a moment, the silence around him felt deafening. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind. Where am I? The memories of the last few moments rushed back. Leora's power, the Valkyrie Inquisitor, her falling into his grasp. His breath caught in his throat. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he pushed himself up, but the sudden movement sent a sharp pain through his side. He groaned, but stubbornly he crawled toward the wall of the cell where he had been thrown. It wasn't a cell. It was a holding chamber, a small, cold room barely large enough to fit him. Bars lined the walls, and faint blue lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows on the floor. He tried to stand but stumbled, his head spinning. "Leora," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the beatings he had taken. He needed to get to her. But before he could take another step, the heavy door at the far end of the room opened with a creaking hiss. A figure stepped inside. A Valkyrie soldier, his posture stiff and military, his face obscured by a helmet. He didn't speak, but his eyes studied Ethan with a calculating coldness. Ethan clenched his fists, his pulse surging. "Where is she?" The soldier didn't answer. Instead, he approached, his footsteps deliberate and slow, his hand reaching for the energy cuffs around Ethan's wrists. The cuffs were damp with sweat and blood, his body still recovering from the shock of the last few minutes. "Answer me," Ethan demanded, his voice rising with fury. The soldier's hand paused just inches from Ethan's wrist. He stared at the human for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and emotionless. "She is safe, for now." Ethan's breath caught. He tried to push past the soldier, but the Valkyrie moved with unnerving speed, blocking his path. "You should be grateful, human." The soldier's voice held an eerie calmness. "If not for the High Inquisitor's orders, you would have already been executed." The soldier grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the door. "The Inquisitor wants to speak with you." Ethan's heart sank as he was roughly pulled into the hallway. The dim lights overhead flickered again as the soldier led him through narrow corridors, passing doors sealed with high-tech locks. The walls were made of dark, cold metal, and the sounds of distant voices echoed off the walls, an ever-present reminder of the terrifying alien presence aboard this ship. The Valkyrie didn't speak again as they walked. Ethan's mind raced. He had to find a way out. Leora's fate was still uncertain, and the Inquisitor would likely have already started planning his execution if he hadn't already been sent for interrogation. As they neared the large door at the end of the corridor, the soldier stopped, placing a hand on the control panel. The door slid open with a heavy hiss, revealing a spacious chamber filled with screens and consoles. At the center, sitting behind a large desk, was High Inquisitor Velos, his mask still intact, his eyes glowing faintly beneath it. The air felt colder in this room, and Ethan could sense the oppressive presence of the Inquisitor. The walls were lined with weapons and advanced technology, the hum of power machines filling the background. Velos didn't acknowledge Ethan immediately. His focus was on a holographic display, his armored fingers tracing lines across the screen. The soldier pushed Ethan forward into the room with a rough shove. Ethan stumbled but quickly regained his balance. "Sit." Velos's voice was like gravel scraping against stone, cold and indifferent. Ethan glared at the Valkyrie, refusing to show any sign of fear. He didn't sit. He stood tall, despite the pain coursing through his body. "You're wasting your time." Ethan's voice was steady, despite the fear gnawing at the back of his mind. "I'm not going to cooperate with you." Velos finally looked up, his glowing eyes locking onto Ethan's. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the silent war of wills. Then Velos tilted his head slightly, as though amused. "You misunderstand, human. I am not asking for your cooperation. I am offering you a choice." Ethan didn't say anything, but he raised an eyebrow, silently urging the Inquisitor to explain. Velos's lips curled into something that resembled a smile beneath his mask. "You're in a situation beyond your comprehension." He stood slowly, walking around the desk toward Ethan. "You're playing at being a hero. But the truth is," Velos paused, his voice low, "you have no place in this battle." Ethan clenched his fists but didn't speak. Velos's hand hovered near a control panel, and a hologram of Leora's face appeared before them. "This is your princess, is it not?" Velos's voice was taunting. She's more powerful than you realize, human. She holds the key to the future of the galaxy, and yet she is blind to the truth of her destiny. A hologram flickered, and Leora's face hardened. Her eyes burned with fury. She will never be yours to control. Ethan's voice was sharp. Velos's eyes flashed. Perhaps not. But with you, I have leverage. You see, I have a proposal for you, human. You can join me. You can become an ally to the Valkyrie, and help us unite the galaxy under our rule. In return, I will spare your life. And hers. Ethan's heart raced as the words sank in. He knew the stakes now, knew that the Inquisitor was playing a dangerous game. But he would never betray Leora. He wouldn't sell his soul for a future under the Valkyrie. He took a deep breath, his voice steady but resolute. I'll never join you, and I'll never let you win. Velos stared at him for a long moment, the silence stretching, heavy and thick. Then, with a sudden motion, he dismissed the hologram. Then we will see how long your resolve lasts, human. Ethan's blood ran cold as Velos moved toward a hidden panel, revealing a set of prisoner transport cuffs, the kind meant to drain energy from those who wore them. Take him to the holding cells. We will begin the interrogation shortly. Velos's voice was cold, final. As the soldier moved forward to grab him, Ethan shot one last glance at the hologram of Leora, his heart pounding with urgency. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to save her. He wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. Ethan was dragged through the narrow corridors of the Valkyrie dreadnought, his limbs heavy and uncooperative from the energy-draining cuffs that shackled his wrists. The soldier beside him kept a tight grip on his arm, his fingers pressing like iron into Ethan's flesh. The further they went, the colder the ship seemed to grow. The dark walls felt oppressive, as if the entire vessel was alive, watching, waiting. Ethan could hear the distant hum of machinery, the occasional hiss of doors opening and closing, and the low murmur of Valkyrie voices. But what haunted him most was the quiet. Lyra's absence was like a hole in his chest. He couldn't understand how the High Inquisitor could be so confident. Ethan had seen the power in her, seen the fire burning within her. She wouldn't just give up without a fight. She was too strong. Still, the looming dread of what might be happening to her gnawed at him. He needed to get to her. He had to. Eventually, they reached a massive set of reinforced doors, the kind meant for high-security prisoners. The soldier punched in a code, and the doors slid open with a low groan. Inside, a small, dimly lit chamber awaited, its walls lined with monitor screens that flickered with various images. At the center of the room stood a single chair, bolted to the floor, surrounded by various interrogation tools, high-tech instruments designed to break both mind and body. Ethan was shoved forward, and the soldier stepped back, leaving him alone in the room. He didn't sit. His eyes quickly scanned the room, searching for any way out. There had to be something, some weakness he could exploit. But the only thing that stood between him and his freedom were the dark, menacing shadows of the Valkyrie. And those shadows were now closing in. The door to the chamber slid open, and High Inquisitor Velos stepped inside, his tall figure imposing. He moved with purpose, his steps echoing in the otherwise silent room. His helmet was still on, his mask hiding his true expression, but Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze piercing through it. Velos didn't speak immediately. He simply walked around the room, his presence filling the space like a suffocating fog. Then he finally stopped in front of Ethan, his voice low and controlled. "You have made your choice, human." Velos's words were cold, devoid of emotion. "You could have joined me. You could have been part of something much greater than yourself. But you chose to be a fool." Ethan clenched his jaw, refusing to show any sign of fear. He wasn't about to give Velos the satisfaction. "And now you will pay the price." Velos's voice dropped to a whisper, the air thickening with the promise of pain. Ethan didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of physical pain. What he feared most was what Velos could do to Leora. Without warning, the Inquisitor snapped his fingers, and the soldier that had accompanied Ethan earlier stepped forward, holding a control device in his hand. The soldier raised it, and a faint buzzing sound filled the room as an energy field shot out from the device, surrounding Ethan's body. Ethan's muscles seized up, locking him in place as the energy field pulsed through him. Every part of him screamed in pain, but he gritted his teeth and refused to give Velos the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. Velos's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "This is your last chance, human. You can still save yourself, your princess. Tell me everything you know about the human resistance." Ethan's heart raced. He wasn't sure how much the Valkyrie knew, but he wasn't about to betray his people. He would never give up the resistance. "I know nothing." He spat the words with as much defiance as he could muster. "I'm just a man who got in the way of your little empire." Velos's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. He wasn't used to being defied, and that fact was clear in the air. The tension grew, and Ethan knew that the Inquisitor wasn't going to back down easily. "Then I will make you talk, human." Velos's voice was dangerously calm. He motioned to the soldier, who stepped forward, placing a strange device on Ethan's forehead. Ethan's skin crawled. He had seen these devices before. It was a mind probe, a Valkyrie method of extracting information by breaking the will of their victims. It wasn't just physical pain that the probe inflicted. It was mental, psychological, the worst kind of torture. Ethan didn't know how much he could take before he broke, but he refused to give in. He thought of Leora, of her strength, her defiance. She wouldn't want him to crumble. He couldn't betray her. As the device activated, a cold wave of energy surged into his mind, sending tendrils of alien influence twisting into his thoughts. His head felt like it was going to split open as images and sounds that weren't his own began to assault him. His thoughts became tangled, drowning in an endless sea of foreign memories. But through the haze, one thought remained clear: "I won't give up. I won't break." He focused on Leora, on the image of her fiery determination, her strength, the bond they shared. Velos's voice suddenly broke through his thoughts, his words venomous. "You will give me the information I seek." But Ethan just shook his head, despite the overwhelming pressure inside his skull. "I will never tell you anything." Velos's eyes flashed with rage, and he snapped his fingers again. The soldier immediately activated the probe to full intensity. Pain. Unrelenting, suffocating pain. It burned through every nerve, every thought. His body went numb, but the torment in his mind felt like it was tearing him apart. For a brief moment, Ethan almost thought he heard Leora's voice, faint but clear, like a whisper through the chaos. "Don't give in. Fight." With everything in him, he clung to that voice, to her words. He wouldn't let this monster win. Not now, not ever. Somewhere in the distance, the door opened again. A voice, one that didn't belong to Velos or the soldier, rang out. "Stop." Ethan's eyes snapped open. The pain faded just as quickly as it had come. A new figure entered the room, a figure Ethan recognized. It was Leora. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes torn, but her eyes blazed with the same power and determination he had seen in her before. She was alive, and she had come to save him.